Good morning, good day, good evening, and welcome to the 45th Annual Caribbean Studies Association Conference. The Caribbean is in turbulent times. This statement remains true today more than ever. The global pandemic brought about by the novel COVID-19 has shone a light on the inequalities that continue to exacerbate the region. It has brought to our attention the plight of achieving the UN Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 and the aspirations for a more inclusive and equitable world. And in this context, the amplification of vaccine apartheid, which has left Caribbean countries undersupplied and vulnerable to the pandemic. It shows the plight of women who, because of their roles of anchoring households while pursuing professionalism and studies, have registered much higher dropout rates and suffered from higher rates of domestic violence during the COVID-19 era. It brings also into stark relief the high levels of crime and the increasing need to be placed on security. More than anything, it has shown that Caribbean culture is metamorphosing as globalization has replaced indigenous Caribbean identities with McDonaldization. Today's Caribbean is not the Caribbean that our forefathers reluctantly freed from the bosom of our former colonial masters. Economic development has been haphazard, and some countries rely on the monocrop of tourism and others staking their hopes on non-renewable fossil fuels such as oil and gas. Colonial inequalities are abound, and the nationalist sentiment is on the rise. As Bell notes, the Caribbean is today a battlefield of an intense struggle of ideologies and a microcosm of the world struggle. It has long been recognized that small states and islands of the Caribbean need each other to engender sustainable development. Rather than band together to deepen political and economic integration, the regional project of today has become reliant on functional cooperation to achieve deeper regionalism. With the move from open regionalism, a byproduct of the 1989 Grand Inns Declaration, to a more mature form of regionalism under the Rose Hall Declaration, Carib sceptics, those who call for deregionalization due to the slow implementation of policy imperative or Caribbean sclerosis, have argued that integration has failed, while Caribophiles, those who assert that a politically integrated CARICOM is the way forward, point to the successful endeavors such as the Free Movement of Skills Act and the Caribbean Vocational Qualification Scheme. However, these functional areas are not enough to ensure a more mature form of Caribbean regionalization. The Caribbean has come of age in an era defined by American exceptionalism, Cuban isolation, and the demise of Great Britain, its colonial mother. Yet, one can only wonder if in a post-Brexit environment, Caribbean countries will be tempted to enact the old economic hegemonic relationship, which ceased to exist with the creation of the World Trade Organization. While the colonial bureaucratic state and its orthodox Westminster institutional system has been hollowed out, to some extent, by the Washington model of neoliberalism, inequality persists and governments face the call for the provision of better social services and more equity. In short, the old system has now been replaced by one driven by Reaganomics and Thatcherism and enmeshed in the fragmented tenets of regionalism, however vague. Citizens have continued to note in private that the bureaucratic elite is out of touch with the local concerns, as everyone is focused on individualism, as communist and socialist sentiment has given way to perceived American democratic principles. Over the past 4 years, with the rise of Trumpism and popularism, Caribbean leaders have failed to recognize that America's market-driven approaches are flawed, and as America has retreated towards isolationism and an America First foreign policy under President Trump, the region has been left to fend for itself. Before Venezuela's demise, the Alba project of Bolivarian socialism was viewed as a threat to the Americanism in the region. As the discussions around reparations have faded into the background, the region faces more threats, both internally and externally, today than it faced in the past 100 years. Our longtime beacons of anti-Western imperialism, Cuban Venezuela, are in chaos and hemorrhaging refugees respectively. China is knocking at our doors, and many countries are letting China in without asking questions. America has all but neglected us and its own backyard. The Middle East and Russia are following China as it peeps over the wall to see what the region can offer, and Latin America is caught up in its own self with the creation of a set of alphabet soups ranging from UNICER to CELAC to ALBA that seek to entice Caribbean states to join them. In other words, the Caribbean is on its own, and its only hope of survival is its human resources. While Caribbean leaders have recognized the potential of regional human capital by enshrining it in the 2030 Human Resource Development Strategy, it does not go far enough. Caribbean leaders have failed to recognize or blatantly omitted that Caribbean societies are fragmented at best. The average Caribbean citizen in their daily lives cannot relate to the Caribbean single market, much less the Caribbean single economy. Caribbean leaders have managed to create a colonial elite-free movement agenda that benefits the educated intelligentsia, and those at the bottom cannot perceive the tangible benefits of regionalism. The middle class and archaic colonial classism holds us in a chokehold. Instead of seeing Caribbean integration as a way forward, our youth put their hopes, dreams, and aspirations into Western imperialism. They do not see the future in our lands, whose jobs do not pay, where nepotism is ripe, and where name and class are still king. One can only wonder what aspects of Caribbean identity and culture will survive in the next 25 years, when much of our future would have left and not returned. One can only wonder what will be the theme of CSA when it turns 70. Will we be celebrating a further fragmented region, or will we be celebrating a more cohesive regional space? Often, in the small states literature, the vulnerability paradox is mentioned as a catalytic challenge as small states face climate change, brain drain, underdevelopment, and so forth. However, often missing from that body of work is the resilience that small states have shown in light of existential threats. We do not give ourselves enough credit for a group of nations still in infancy, paddling their way to a fully realized state. If we are to take a page from our past, we can see that small states, with their flexibility, family and personal relationships, and ability to get things done, can actually be market leaders rather than followers. In many instances, as small states, we have pioneered ways forward and taken on leadership roles, but often not credited for these. Too often, Caribbean leaders have continued to perpetuate the intellectualism of the colonial oppressors by choosing to rely on the white man for beneficence and guidance. We have such a damaged self-esteem of ourselves that we do not look inwards for standards, but find ourselves bowing to the Western world's idea of what's good and right. We have continued to create an educated colonial elite that sits at the top of our corporations, universities, and schools. We continue to rely on the benevolence of Mother England and hang on to the Commonwealth as if it supports our visions. In short, we remain stuck in a colonial quagmire that continues to benefit our former colonial masters. If nothing else, the Black Lives Movement and the anti-racist movement has shown that the region has never really dealt with issues of colorism, racism, and sectarian strife. Instead, these issues come to the forefront every 4 or 5 years when national elections are held, particularly in Guyana and Trinidad and Tobago, we then dismiss them as one-off events. How can we successfully generate regional development when we have not begun to confront our historical colonial past? How can we talk about shared Caribbean identity or one Caribbean when we have not confronted issues of sexual oppression and colonial sodomy laws continue to be on the books in many Caribbean territories? How can we talk about an inclusive Caribbean when our girls, mothers, and sisters are ill-treated and not respected? But slowly, the glass ceiling is cracking. This was achieved with the appointment of the first woman Secretary General of CARICOM, Dr. Carla Burnett, and prior to that, the selection of Professor Paloma Mohammed as the first female to hold such a post in the English-speaking Caribbean. These feats should only embolden regional leaders to go forth for a different kind of regionalism. As the old guard changes, one dominated by men who were educated in the Oxbridge colonial tradition, the hope is that women can turn the regional project around. One can only wonder if it's too late or if Caribbean peoples can come together in the same way as they did to throw off their oppressors and build a sort of regional project that can sustain the region and create a viable place for the next generation. Too often, we're told that Caribbean education should be developing a generation whose jobs have not been created and that they must be inculcated with 21st century skills of communication, collaboration, creativity, and critical thinking. But the question beckons, are Caribbean educational systems ready for such a challenge, or are they stuck in the colonial past of rote learning? At the dawning of the fourth industrial revolution, which blends the physical with the cyber-physical, the Caribbean needs the political and economic regionalism if its labor force is to be ready for 21st century jobs. In fact, the COVID era has created an opportunity to invest in digitization, not only in the ways we learn and teach, but it should act as a catalyst for the ways we do business more efficiently. Now turning to Guyana. As Guyana relies on fossil fuels to develop its nascent economy, will it risk its existing natural state through disastrous environmental consequences and lack of care? Guyana has many models to follow. It can learn from China's mistakes of suppression and human rights, the European Union's refugee crisis and integration issues, from Africa's challenges of poverty and a growing income gap, and from the Middle East and North African regions post-Arab Spring issues of democratic consolidation. Drawing lessons and policy borrowing are natural policy tools to employ on the cusp of development, but it is still too early to identify what path Guyana will take. It is also unclear how much of the proposed oil boom will trickle down to the average person and how much of it will end up in the pockets of politicians. The World Bank, in its systematic country diagnostics of Guyana's economy, has argued that Guyana can become a high-income oil-producing country by 2030 with a GDP of approximately $14 billion. This is up from $3.3 billion in 2019. This would mean that if per capita GDP remains the same, it would exceed $16,900 per person by 2030. Economic development is complicated and complex, but Guyana's new government needs to take a step back and figure out which development model will serve it best. For this to happen, there would need to be a policy shift towards greater investment in human capital and the mass eradication of poverty while dealing with the current refugee crisis. After all, Guyana has to deal with numerous challenges its other small sister states did not have to deal with in the 1960s and 70s when they industrialized. Moreover, questions remain as to if Guyana's human resource development is ready to take advantage of the opportunities that the new oil marketplace will provide. No longer can Guyana look to its colonial mother for help and handouts, but it must now forge a path that is self-reliant and self-sufficient. But the question remains, can it do this? Can Guyana be a leader? Can it rise from the development ashes like a phoenix? Can it lead the way? How will it comply with the aspirations of local content? What emphasis will be placed on the enhanced role of the National University as a driver of innovation, research, and creative thinking? As we gather to begin the 45th conference of the Caribbean Studies Association under the theme of identity politics, industry, ecology, and intelligent economy in Caribbean societies, I wish to thank the participants who join us from all parts of the globe. This includes almost 1,000 Guyanese teachers and students, and most of all, I wish to thank the University of Guyana for co-hosting this event. It is my pleasure to warmly welcome you to Guyana, to our virtual conference, and I hope that you will discuss the questions that I have raised here today over the course of the coming week. Thank you.